Well, good evening. I'm Bernard Brady, Chair of the Theology Department at St. Thomas. You are all very welcome here tonight. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship, a program housed in the Theology Department with an advisory board and for faculty and staff of several departments and schools across the university. Our event tonight is co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity, the Center for Catholic Studies, the History Department, the Sociology Department, the Justice and Peace Studies Department, and the Office of Community Engagement. The Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship seeks to create a platform for theological voices in conversation with other disciplines to reach the public in the service of civil discourse, the common good, and faithful citizenship. It seeks to disseminate theological and interdisciplinary research applicable to public life, including economic, political, and social issues. It works to develop and enrich the Catholic profile of the university by improving interdisciplinary communication and cooperation. We do this through a variety of ways, including university-wide discussion groups, public conferences, and lectures. We are very excited about tonight's guest and his lecture. The Institute would like to publicly recognize and thank Mr. Harry McNeely, who is with us tonight, for his generous gift supporting our programming and this event. President Julie Sullivan will introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Dr. Sullivan became the 15th president of our university in July 2013. Those of us on campus know her for her passionate pursuit of excellence and her determination to see the university fulfill its mission and its responsibility in the world. Coupled with this is her wonderful sense of humor and her calming presence. Community leaders beyond the Arches know her for her work on boards of directors and of business and charitable organizations. Please welcome President Sullivan.
Good evening. Wow, this is fabulous. It's just so wonderful to see all of you here with us this evening. And I do have the special opportunity to introduce Archbishop Joseph Tobin, who will speak to us tonight about the Catholic Church's response to refugee resettlement issues in the United States. But before I do that, I would like to thank Archbishop Hebda. Our own Archbishop is here with us tonight, and we are indeed very blessed as an archdiocese. And every time he's with us on our campus, it's a really wonderful and joyous occasion, wonderful fellowship, wonderful community, and we just so appreciate having you as our Archbishop. So now I get the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Archbishop Tobin is a native of Detroit. He's the eldest of 13 children. He professed his vows as a member of the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer in 1973. Earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in philosophy from Holy Redeemer College in Waterford, Wisconsin, and then attended Mount St. Alphonsus Seminary in New York. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1978 and holds master's degrees from Mount St. Alphonsus in religious education and divinity. He returned to Detroit after his education and served as associate pastor and then pastor of Holy Redeemer Parish until 1990, when he became pastor of St. Alphonsus Parish in Chicago. The following year, he moved to Rome to serve as general consultor for the Redemptorist congregation, and in 1997, he became the congregation's superior general there. Pope Benedict named him Archbishop Secretary of the Vatican's Religious Congregation in August 2010. And 2 weeks ago, just last week, he appointed him to serve, 2 years ago, just last week, appointed him to serve as Archbishop of Indianapolis. One of the first initiatives that Archbishop Tobin undertook when he went to Indianapolis was to convene the bishops of the state and lead them in writing a pastoral letter on poverty in Indiana, something he spoke with us about at dinner, and I hope he'll have some words about that again this evening as well. He again made headlines by challenging the governor of Indiana's request not to resettle refugees from Syria and to uphold the archdiocesan practice of resettling refugees for the last 40 years. The timing of this lecture is quite fortuitous because 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis announced that Archbishop Tobin will be named a cardinal, along with Chicago Archbishop Blaise Cupich, who graduated from St. Thomas in 1971. Their installation will formally occur at the Vatican on November 19th. Fittingly, it will be on the eve of the conclusion of Pope Francis's Holy Year of Mercy. We are so delighted at the University of St. Thomas with these appointments, and we congratulate you, Archbishop Tobin. Now, please join me in a warm St. Thomas welcome for Archbishop Joseph Tobin.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, and I thank all of the faculty for this lovely invitation. And thank you for this fabulous turnout. You know, I have a very sort of sanguine attitude towards large crowds because the great cultural event in my archdiocese happens towards the end of May, and it's called the Indianapolis 500. And I think there's a certain percentage of those 400,000 people that are coming to see a car crash. So if that's what brought you here, I hope you won't be disappointed. And I'm so glad that my brother Bernie is here. I think he's such a gift to the church, but especially to the Twin Cities. And I should warn you that I've talked to the people who are separating those questions, and the really tough ones are going to go to you. 25 years ago, when I used to work honestly in the church, I was a pastor on the north side of Chicago. I mean, those people are really celebrating right now if you follow me. And I still stay in touch with them, not just about the Cubs, but they write to me about their families and what's going on and who's gone home to God. And I had an email from a young father who was a little kid when I knew him, and who was talking about a conversation he had with his 7-year-old son, walking home from church one Sunday. And the dad, whose name is Tom, turned to Sam, his 7-year-old son, and he said, "Sam, who do you think Father was talking to today? I mean, was he talking to the grown-ups or was he talking to the little kids?" And Sam thought it over, and he said, "I think he was talking to himself." And I think that's an occupational hazard for people who do what I do. But tonight, I really hope not to be talking to myself, because I would like to explore with you an issue that concerns us who are believers, but it concerns us who are Americans, citizens, and who are reflective and anxious about the civic values of our country. Last February, I believe there was a billboard outside St. Cloud that said Catholic Charities resettling Islamicists, insanity or evil. Now, it only stood up there for a few days before somebody convinced the advertiser to take it down. But I think it was reflecting a value, a discourse that is alive in our society today. I believe one presidential candidate referred to your state as a hotbed for the recruiting of terrorists because of your generous policy in resettling immigrants from Somalia. And that same candidate on the 9th of this month called for a policy of extreme vetting of refugees coming from Syria. He justified his position because, and I quote, "They're coming in tens of thousands into our country like we have no idea who they are, where they're from, what their feelings about our country are." That candidate termed the present efforts by the federal government to resettle refugees from Syria the great Trojan horse of all time. Now, he made those statements on the 9th of October. 3 days later, on Wednesday, October 12th, the Bishop of Rome issued a clear call for communities throughout the world to welcome. See if I can get my thing going here. Derek, there you go, thanks. For the communities of nations to intensify efforts to receive and resettle refugees and immigrants, emphasizing the dramatic plight of the child immigrants in countries around the world, Pope Francis appealed to everyone, and he said, that is, states, institutions, and religious communities, to work for the protection and integration of child migrants. He also emphasized the pressing need for long-term solutions that tackle the root causes of this phenomena. And if you're familiar at all with the discourse around and the statistics around refugees and immigrants, you know that is the dramatic challenge facing the world today. The positions of Mr. Trump and Pope Francis regarding the resettlement of refugees, particularly those fleeing the carnage in Syria, are well known and diametrically opposed. Policy regarding refugees figures prominently in the rhetoric of this election cycle. Derek, there you go. Late last year, the state of Indiana provided a stage for this debate when the policies of its governor were contested by different faith-based organizations, including the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Indianapolis. So I'm really grateful to the university for this opportunity to discuss with you the events of last November and December against the backdrop of the enormous humanitarian tragedy and the ethical claims that such a crisis has on the citizens of this country. This is what I hope to do. First, to trace the history of refugee resettlement in the United States before describing my decision to continue to welcome Syrian refugees, a decision that put me at odds with Governor Mike Pence, now the vice presidential candidate. Then I'll invite you to look with me at the fear that blinds fellow citizens to the human tragedy of those fleeing violence in Syria before considering an ethical response. I'm delighted that my modest contribution will be followed by an opportunity for questions and clarification. Go ahead, Derek. There you go. Please allow me to continue with a brief summary of the organized resettlement of migrants in the United States. Since its foundation, the United States has offered freedom and opportunity to refugees fleeing the most dangerous and desperate situations in the world. The United States Refugee Resettlement Program reflects the core values of the United States and our strong tradition of providing a safe haven for the oppressed. Refugees have been coming to the shores of this country since pilgrims fled religious persecution in 17th century England. However, the U.S. Congress enacted the first refugee legislation only in 1948, following the admission of more than 250,000 displaced Europeans in the wake of World War II. This legislation provided for the admission of over 400,000 displaced Europeans in the coming years, or the years that followed. Later laws provided for the admission of persons fleeing communism, largely from China, Hungary, Korea, Poland, and Yugoslavia, and in the 1960s, those fleeing the regime in Cuba. Many of these waves of refugees were assisted by American ethnic and religious-based non-for-profit organizations, which form the base of today's vibrant public-private partnership in the United States in order to settle refugees. With the fall of Saigon in April of 1975, the U.S. faced the challenge of resettling hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. As a result, Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which standardized federally supported resettlement services for all refugees admitted to the United States. The act incorporates the definition of refugee that is found in the United Nations Refugee Convention. Derek, if you want to flip it up there, you can see a refugee in the legal terms of the United States and in the understanding of the United Nations is someone who owing to a fear of persecution, thank you, for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. This act incorporates this definition and provides for the legal establishment of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, since 1975, the United States has resettled 3 million refugees. Most have come from Vietnam or the former Soviet Union, although more than 70 nationalities have been represented in that program. Since the enactment of the Refugee Act of 1980, annual admission figures have ranged from a high of 207,000 in 1980 to a low of 27,000 following the attacks of 9/11, 2001. 70,000 refugees were admitted to the United States in 2013 and 2014. This fiscal year, the United States plans to accept 85,000, including 10,000 Syrians. I believe the President was noting that if they haven't met that goal, the United States is very close to it. But you have to put those figures in perspective. That's a fraction of what other countries are doing. Contrast the figure of 10,000 Syrians welcomed this year in the United States to the situation in Lebanon, a country of 4 million people, which has admitted 1.5 million refugees from Syria. Or think of Greece, the most economically challenged country in the European Union, who is welcoming boat people not only from Syria, but from North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa with great generosity. Refugees having suffered great losses, including the loss of their homes, their livelihood, possessions, and oftentimes families, need assistance starting over in the new country. Derek, you want to hit it? There you go, thanks. Their initial needs are many: food, clothing, shelter, employment. They need to learn English and be orientated to a new community and culture. Catholic Charities agencies have been providing services to refugees and immigrants for more than 100 years, an ongoing demonstration of a strong commitment to serve the most vulnerable in our society. In partnership with its affiliates, the United States Department of State, the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, the Conference of Catholic Bishops and its Migrant and Refugee Services resettles approximately 30% of the refugees that arrive in the United States each year. You can see in that bottom row some of the other major partners: World Relief, International Rescue Committee, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. In Indiana, the two big players in refugee resettlement are Exodus Refugee, which is a wonderful project of the Episcopalian Church of Indiana, and Catholic Charities of Indianapolis. The Catholic Refugee Resettlement Network includes over 100 diocesan offices across the country, as well as in Guam and Puerto Rico. Last year, Catholic Charities settled a third of the approximately 70,000 refugees that arrived in the United States. There you can see some of our team. The Conference of Bishops, together with Migrant Refugee Services, continually searches for innovative and cost-effective approaches to help refugees rebuild their lives. Over the years, Archdiocesan Catholic Charities have found the best approach to resettlement is one that emphasizes early employment for refugees as the mean to self-sufficiency while addressing their transitional needs. The courage and resiliency of refugees are shown in the high rate of employment found among refugees at just 6 months after their arrival in the United States. It's interesting, I grew up in the city of Detroit where my 12 siblings and I were born. But when I was 19, we emigrated to Canada. And following the fall of Saigon, the Diocese of London obliged every parish in the diocese in southwest Ontario to adopt a refugee family. All parishes complied. 1 year later, practically none of the parishes were subsidizing the refugee family. They had found work, and I imagine most of their kids are doctors now. Resettling refugees provides an extraordinary opportunity for countless Americans to take an active part in offering a caring and supportive environment for refugees as they begin their new lives. It goes without saying that without volunteers and resources from the community and parishes, Catholic Charities, the USCCB, and Migrant Refugee Services would be unable to accomplish the tremendous task of giving refugees new hope and the opportunity to begin their lives again. The woman in red is the director of our Migration Refugee Services, Heidi Smith. On her right is an Iraqi gentleman who recently became a United States citizen. Now, we have a proud tradition as Americans and as Catholic Americans in welcoming the stranger. This proud welcoming tradition of our country, as well as the fruitful cooperation between the state of Indiana and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Indianapolis, foundered in the last quarter of 2015. Now, what triggered the event happened in September. You might recall those attacks in Paris and surrounding areas. During the attacks, there was a passport found by one of the slain attackers that seemed to be a Syrian passport. So in the light of that discovery, which is a little bit specious, a number of state governors began to announce they would no longer accept refugees coming from Syria. On November 16th of last year, citing concerns about safety and security, Governor Pence blocked Syrian refugees from resettling in Indiana. In a statement, Pence said he would bar Syrian refugees from resettling in Indiana until the federal government could make sure that, quote, proper security measures are in place, unquote. In a letter that was dated November 17th of last year, the director of the Indiana Family and Social Services Administration, our partner in the state and refugee resettlement, informed the refugee resettlement program of our archdiocese, and I'd like to quote from that letter, "We would ask that you notify your national resettlement agency that the scheduled placement of the Syrian family scheduled to arrive on Thursday, December 10th, and all subsequent Syrian arrivals be suspended or redirected to another state that is willing to accept Syrian placements until assurances that proper security measures are in place and provided by the federal government." Now, who are we talking about? This family that was coming from Syria was a mom and dad and 2 little kids. They had been in a refugee resettlement camp in Jordan for 3 years. And for about 2.5 of those years, they had been undergoing rigorous examinations by different organs of the United States government under the oversight and coordination of the Department of Homeland Security. Some of those agencies included the National Counterterrorism Center, other elements from the intelligence community, the FBI, and the State Department. Following the receipt of that letter, I requested a meeting with Governor Pence. And so on Wednesday, December 2nd, a small delegation arrived at the State House in Indianapolis. I was accompanied by the Director of Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese, Heidi Smith, whom you saw in that picture, our coordinator for refugee resettlement, the Director of the Indiana Catholic Conference, our liaison with the legislature, as well as an Iraqi refugee, Ali, who was resettled by our program nearly a decade ago and who had recently become an American citizen. I invited Ali to join our little group in order to put a face on refugees, to show the governor and his staff what the statistics actually look like. Ali was eager to talk about his degree in English from the University of Baghdad, his present employment as captain of coffee service at a major Indianapolis hotel, and his hopes that one day his family would be allowed to join him. During the course of the meeting, the governor spoke of his desire to protect the citizens of the state from terrorism. He reminded us of the discovery of that famous passport in the vicinity of the body of one dead attacker in Paris, and cited the director of the FBI, and quoting that he was unable to guarantee that Syrians entering this country were not a threat to its citizens. He was confident that the legislation pending in Congress would close any loopholes in the vetting process. You might recall there was an act before Congress called SAVE, and it was, I forget what the acronym exactly meant, but it was basically to close not only loopholes, but close doors, especially to refugees from the Middle East. He asked me not to permit the resettlement of the family, who were scheduled to arrive the following week. The mother of the little family had a sister in Indianapolis. He also advised me to pray and seek God's guidance before deciding, something that I was happy to do. And after that search, I was convinced that the decision to bar the family was immoral, capricious, and probably illegal. The following Saturday, December 5th, 2015, I telephoned the governor and respectfully informed him that the Archdiocese would welcome the family as planned. We were prepared to support the family if the state denied funding as had been threatened. And it was really good to have a priest who was an airport chaplain, because he could get them past any press that were waiting around. In a press release, I reiterated the reasons behind my decision. This is what I tried to say to not simply to the governor, but to the people of goodwill who are wondering why on earth we do this. 3 years ago, this family fled the violence of terrorists in their homeland of Syria. After 2 years of extensive security checks and personal interviews, the United States government has approved them to enter our country. The United States State Department asked the Archdiocese of Indianapolis to help resettle this family. For 40 years, the Archdiocese Refugee and Immigrant Services have welcomed people fleeing violence in various regions of the world. This welcome is an essential part of our Catholic identity, and we will continue this life-saving tradition. Following the decision to settle the Syrian refugees in the state, Governor Mike Pence's spokesman, Matt Lloyd, stated, "The governor holds Catholic Charities in the highest regard, but respectfully disagrees with the decision to place a Syrian refugee family in Indiana at this time." So that more or less was the scenario. But I think the scenario provokes some pretty important questions. How could good people, I believe that the governor is a good man and a very profoundly devoted Christian. How could they turn their back not simply on more than a century of civic tradition in this United States, but also on some of the central values of their faith. Well, before I get to that question, I'd like to say, well, what's happened in the year since we shook hands in his office? Congress did not enact more stringent legislation as the governor had hoped. That SAVE bill passed the House, but did not carry the Senate. The carnage in Syria has continued unabated. In this last year, more than 3,500 people have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. This nearly 600 more people as compared to the same period last year. According to a press release earlier this fall from the Save the Children Foundation, among the dead are at least 600 children. Exodus, refugee immigration, you might remember that service of the Episcopalian Church in Indiana, filed suit in federal court against Governor Pence and against the Secretary of Indiana Family and Social Services to block the cutoff of funds to the Archdiocese and to Exodus. On February 29th of this year, a U.S. District Judge, Tanya Walton-Pratt, in a 35-page ruling, said that Indiana's policy amounted to unconstitutional discrimination on the basis of national origin, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, as well as a number of instances of civil rights law. She granted a preliminary injunction that prohibited Indiana from taking any actions to interfere with or attempt to deter the resettlement of Syrian refugees by a private agency. The governor appealed that ruling to the Seventh Circuit Court. And on September 14th, just last month, the Solicitor General argued that the state has a compelling interest in protecting its residents from the well-documented threats of terrorists posing as refugees to gain entry into Western societies. Now, before I let you know what the three-panel judge decided, it's worth remembering that this particular circuit, the Seventh Circuit, is known for a conservative interpretation of the law. And in fact, one of these three judges is on the list that was published by Mr. Trump as possible Supreme Court nominees if he's elected. So these were not the American Civil Liberties Union who are ruling. What did they say? The three-judge panel unanimously rejected the governor's argument that terrorists are posing as Syrian refugees to gain entry into the United States, calling it nightmare speculation based on no evidence. Indeed, the court said the state presented no evidence that any Syrian refugee had been involved in a terrorist act within the United States. The panel's ruling is the latest in a series of federal court decisions that have rejected similar attempts by other states to avoid Syrian refugee resettlement. Interestingly, one of those judges is on Mr. Trump's list. And finally, in the last year, the Archdiocese Catholic Charities in Indianapolis has continued to resettle refugees, including those whom the governor fears, welcoming 52 more Syrians in this calendar year. So once again, I return to that question, why? What would cause good people to turn their backs in this face of human tragedy? Well, I think the simple answer is, of course, it's fear. And fear is one of the great motivators of human behavior. Well, where does the fear come from? Well, I would like to suggest, and maybe in a too general or superficial way, three sources for the fear that grips some of our fellow citizens, and yes, even members of our church community. The first source of the fear are the threats of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. This most immediate cause of fear is found in well-publicized threats of terrorist groups. The Islamic State has specifically said it will send agents to sow havoc in the West. That's what's been threatened. What has happened? The majority of casualties of ISIS have been Muslims in the Middle East. What about those remarks of the FBI director? Derek, can we flip so, I missed that one. No, just keep going forward. There he is. James Comey, the FBI director. Because the most common Republican refrain about vetting voiced by Pence a year ago and more recently by Donald Trump many times since is that the FBI director James Comey has stated it's impossible to know for certain who these refugees are. Those remarks, though, were made in a very particular context that has been omitted by voices in the political discourse. When faced with proposed Republican-sponsored legislation, that SAVE Act that was before Congress last year, one of the representatives asked the FBI director and other top national security officials to personally vouch for each admitted refugee. The director balked at the notion. And this is what he said in context in December of last year. Could I certify to there being no risk associated with an individual? The Bureau doesn't take positions on legislation, and we don't get involved in policy decisions. But that is vouching for each and every refugee would be practically impossible. Now think about that. Not wanting to assume direct personal responsibility for each refugee is a very different thing than saying there's no way to vet them. The second source, and here sometimes I feel like one of these old buck bishops that I used to not listen to. You can tell the preacher's sins by what he preaches about. But I can't ignore the role of the media, and especially the 24-hour cable news. You know that there's a saying in how stories are selected, a certain hierarchy, and I think you know it. If it bleeds, it leads. Turn on the news tonight and see what's especially on a couple of those outlets. Now, news is a for-profit industry, and I would argue one that doesn't always strive to report facts accurately. Have you noticed how difficult it is to be informed straightforwardly about local and national issues? In truth, watching the news can be a psychologically risky pursuit, which could undermine your mental and physical health. Now, fear-based news stories like this one, you can read the caption, terrorists inbound, taking refugees could open door to jihadists. They capture our attention, and if we're not aware, they hold us hostage. Being glued to the television, reading the newspaper, or surfing the internet increases ratings and market shares, but it also raises the probability of eliciting hysteria and hatred. Think how many times you hear a correspondent ask someone, I'm not asking you to speculate, but. Reminds me when I was working in Rome, I'd occasionally pass around something I was going to publish, and I'd ask my colleagues, what do you think? And one or the other would say, well, I didn't read it, but. I said, you didn't read it, you got nothing to say. Both the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle and no-holds-barred competition have forced much of today's television news to look to the spectacular, the stirring, and the controversial as news stories. It's no longer a race to break the story first or to get the facts straight. Instead, the race is to acquire good ratings in order to maintain advertisers and profits. So you hear vague language like sleeper cells. Are there sleeper cells in the United States? You hear a strange process that's described as radicalization, a new neologism that is a mysterious thing that happens when people, young people, view certain propaganda. This contributes to the fear in the United States, and it eventually, if it's repeated long enough, it will be believed. Now, I had an experience of that when I was the Superior General of the Redemptorists. The Redemptorists, and you may have read about it because it made even some of the media in this country, have a radio station in Western Poland. Now, it wouldn't be my cup of tea, but they do a lot of good for the shut-ins and also young people. But there were accusations from the Israeli government that it was an anti-Semitic radio station. I said, fine, give me a transcript of, you're listening, you're monitoring their transmissions, show me something that's anti-Semitic and I'll deal with it. Well, they brought the American ambassador to the Holy See at the time. And with the American ambassador, there's an ambassador for Holocaust Affairs. And he said to me, this is an anti-Semitic. I said, Your Excellency, show me, because I won't operate on rumors. He said, they're not rumors. He said, everybody's reported it. It's in the media. I said, okay, let me give you a hypothetical case. Say I really want to invade a country. Like my life isn't going to be complete unless I can invade this country. This is hypothetical. But I don't have a reason to, at least a credible reason, to put before the world. So I think, and then I come up with one. Weapons of mass destruction. And then I begin to repeat it. And I say it over and over again, that this country that I really want to invade has weapons of mass destruction. I even get the great giants of media, including the New York Times, to say that this hypothetical country has weapons of mass destruction. And so I get to invade it. And I destroy its infrastructure. I unleash incredible destructive forces. Hundreds of thousands of people die. And guess what? There aren't any weapons of mass destruction, even though everybody said there were. I said, do you get my point? And he said, yeah, I think I catch your drift. But the point here is that because you hear things, you must listen critically to what's being said. And I think we as a community, if we know an alternative narrative, have to have the courage to state it. The final reason, which I think is a much more subtle reason, is a product of what's happening in the world and has been happening for some time. It's generally called globalization, which is has other features, the diffusion of information and learning across the world. But this globalizing force produces an opposite reaction. It's a reaction that invites people to reinforce their boundaries. Why? Because there's a fear that who I am and who we are together is slipping out of our hands. Somebody is threatening our identity. And so in part, I think this propagation of fear has been provoked by postmodernity, understood as a sense of cultural circumstances that signifies the obliteration of boundaries and the confusion of categories. Societies experience globalization in a very graphic way in the migration of peoples. And so today, Derek, if you want to, the most embodied form of globalization, such as the movements of refugees and migrants, are increasingly restricted, while the most disembodied forms, such as the circulation of financial instruments and codes, are the most deregulated. This reaction to the globalizing tendency has the need of an other to oppose. because the opposition to the other defines who I am. And for us, Americans, the other arguably has become Muslims from the Middle East. So those three reasons, I think, are behind the fear. First, the credible threats and well-publicized threats of groups in the Middle East. Secondly, an irresponsible reporting of events and speculation. And thirdly, this reaction to a globalizing tendency in our world today. Now, how does the church react to this? Well, I think Archbishop Kurtz, who's the president of the Conference of Catholic Bishops last fall, said it in a nutshell. And if you want to flip, no, one back, I think. There, one more, keep going, one more. No, I guess. Regardless of their religious affiliation or national origin, these refugees are above all human persons, made in the image of God, bearing inherent dignity and deserving our respect and care and protection by law from persecution. It's enlightening to note that each of the three great world religions, commonly referred to as religions of the book, assign far-reaching consequences to the simple act of saving the life of one person. Judaism teaches that he who saves the life of another has saved the entire world, while Islam characterizes the rescue of another as saving of the whole people. Christianity teaches an even more radical imperative. In Jesus, God identifies himself with those to whom service is given or refused. And our behavior towards others is our behavior towards God. When did we see you, a stranger, and not welcome you? Amen, I say to you, whatever you did to one of these least brothers and sisters of mine, you did to me. In addressing this issue, the Conference of Bishops has called for, first, the continuation of the resettlement of refugees from Syria and the United States. And they point out that the security of our citizens and the resettlement of refugees are not contradictory. It's not an either-or situation. The United States can continue to welcome refugees while continuing to ensure our own security, and we must do both. Control over immigration and refugee admissions to the United States is a federal responsibility. Governors and states do not have the legal authority to determine who's admitted to the United States and who lives in their states. Once you're admitted by the federal government to the United States, you can live wherever you want. After careful screening, Syrian refugees are legally admitted. Like other lawfully admitted persons, they have the rights to freedom of movement within the United States. No, but governors do have an important role, and I think your governor here is to be commended in welcoming refugees who have a long history of revitalizing many U.S. communities. The United States Refugee Program has a long history as a nonpartisan public-private partnership between the federal government, state governments, and the local communities, including Catholic charities and social services across the country. And so the bishops encourage governors to continue playing their important welcoming role. We also urge public officials to avoid reactions that politicize events, whether in Paris or elsewhere, and to avoid misplaced blame that creates an atmosphere of fear. Instead, we urge public officials to stand in solidarity with Syrian refugees who themselves are victims of terrorism. During his visit to the United States a year ago, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, implored all us Americans to remember the Golden Rule and to help refugees rather than to view them as problems. Now, personally, I never say in conclusion, because somebody once said, defined second wind as what happens when a bishop says in conclusion. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph flee the terror of Herod. They're the archetype of every refugee family today. It is crucial that the Catholic community and all people of good faith or goodwill contest the climate of fear that has festered in this country, particularly in the last 15 years. This fear dehumanizes us, causing us to abandon some of our most precious religious and civic values, making us less than what we are called to be. And I think the greatest service we can provide, and hopefully how I can end this presentation this evening, is to recall that if we want to do terrible things to people, the first thing we have to do is take away their humanity. The greatest gift perhaps the church can do for these suffering people as we welcome them and resettle them is to give them a face like these. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archbishop, for your moving talk. We're going to give the Archbishop a few minutes to collect themselves, and we're going to have some questions. And here, again, is our process. We have students with pieces of paper and pens. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll pass them out and collect them. So Tasha, run down the aisle here. Lori, Ruth has had. This will take a moment, and then we'll collect them and ask you some questions. Thanks. No, you just ask a question. If you're a student, we'd like you to mark that you're a student. Raise your hand down here. So if you have one to be collected, raise your hand and we will. We have one question.
Does it say HEBDA at the top?
Thank you.
Good. Let's start out.
Good question. Okay. Again, raise your hand if you have a finished question. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Would you want to go first?
All right, we have a question here from a student. Is there... Is there any gray area for a Catholic on this issue? And this is from a student.
Is there any gray area? Well, let me see if I can figure out what the gray area is. I mean, is there ambiguity? Well, I suppose if there is ambiguity, it might be if our resources are terribly limited, you know, how much can we parse out to? Is there can we say that, can we somehow wish away what Jesus was talking about, you know, in that famous, you know, what you do welcoming the stranger, you do to me. If there is ambiguity in my life, I'd have to ask, where does it come from? You know, does it come from because there's something else in Scripture that convinces me otherwise? Or in the tradition of our church? If the gray area is produced by something else, I think I'd want to know what that is, you know, in my own decision making. So is there room for ambiguity? I think most of us struggle with our moral life, both as individuals and as a society. But if the struggle is to really understand what Jesus is asking, I have to ask myself, well, where does that ambiguity come from? And could it come from some of those sources I cited?
Archbishop, there are so many homeless people in the United States right now. Shouldn't we be taking care of our own people before we allow another 10,000 refugees?
We can do both. We absolutely can do both.
This student question builds on that. Will allowing more refugees strain the U.S. in terms of taxes and resources?
If there is a strain, then we have to ask ourselves, should we be making different choices in our society as a whole? You know, if I find it difficult to help the poor as a person, as Joe Tobin, well, then I have to say, well, maybe I would have more possibility if I made a different choice in other areas of my life. And so I think that there are larger questions that we have to ask about the way we as a society decide to support and what we tend to give away. I mean, if my life is a selfie, 24/7, I'm going to make certain decisions, and I'm going to neglect a whole lot of other ones because that's the way I understand my life. If I think that my true happiness is going to be found in helping others, I think I'll make decisions accordingly.
You already had mentioned our state in reference to our state in the news.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a local question. It may be too local and too particular, but I think you can respond more generally. Minneapolis is one of the 3 U.S. areas targeted by the FBI for a program called Countering Violent Extremism, CVE. It targets the local Somali community, searching for, quote, potential terrorists. The Somali community sees the program as an unwarranted infiltration since other groups are not targeted. Some cases appear to have been entrapment. So a general question about.
Yeah, well, I think that depending on what era of history we're talking about, I can recall in the 1970s and 80s, there were segments of the Irish community, particularly the recent immigrants from Ireland and from the north of Ireland, who were targeted for special investigations by the FBI, an organization called NORAD, the Northern Irish Relief, because of alleged ties with the Irish Republican Army. Now, a lot of the Irish that were vetted had no connection at all, and somehow we didn't boot out all the Irish, thanks be to God. The March 17th would be much too calm. So yes, I know. I'm familiar with what's happened, or at least I've read about what's happened here in the Twin Cities because of the high concentration of Somali, and I believe that there were 9 young men that were tried and convicted of. Okay, do you want to indict a whole community on that emphasis? Because in some of the bars in Boston, the collection did go to the IRA. I know that. Do you indict a whole community on that aspect? No. I think we're more intelligent than that.
Another student question here. What can Syrian refugees do to disown terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda to make it known that they are not involved with these groups?
Well, if you know any refugees, you know that one of the things they don't have is much power. If you know any refugees and you ask them, you'll find out that they want to live. They want to heal. They want to have a family. They want to worship God. They want to earn their keep. They don't have access to the media like others do. They can't get up and say, this is all malarkey, what you're hearing, because that's not the way we are. I think that people who ask questions like that maybe need access to that community, which is very difficult these days. We have it in Catholic Social Services because we don't just bring people in and say good luck. We stay with them for several years after they've been resettled. And the interesting thing about that little family, the two kids are so excited about going to school that they wake up their parents on Sunday. Imagine that. Telling them they got to get to school. They're afraid they're going to miss class. You know, by and large, these are voiceless people. And so bad things can be done to them.
Three or four students asked the question, what could they do as students?
Well, I think one thing you could do is if you contact Catholic Charities here in the Archdiocese, some of our students, our college-age students, tutor. They take people shopping. You know, I imagine a lot of the students here have traveled abroad. And, you know, there's that adventure of trying to figure things out. But there are times when you just wish you had somebody that would tell you, you know, what that sign said or where you could find, you know, your favorite food or something. Well, imagine that, people that have been uprooted from unspeakable violence, and they're plucked down in this completely different society. The human touch, the human contact, and you don't even have to worry about speaking another language. The language of the heart reaches out. So I think Catholic Charities here in the Archdiocese would be able to give you some really good possibilities. And I think the greatest thing you can do is listen and think when you hear this sort of rhetoric, you know, and ask how much of it is asking you to fear. You know, Jesus says that, you know, that fear is useless. What we need to do is trust God, and not only trust God, but trust God's word and trust the vocation we receive as Catholic Christians.
The student question here is one that I think invites a great and deep reflection at this time of year. The question is, who will you vote for in the fall? But I think it points to the fact that many are going to be voting for the first time, and there's that question of how does one work with the various competing values?
I think that's, you know, I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to vote for. But I will tell you this. I really feel, I've been on a couple of college campuses in our archdiocese, and students with a fair degree of anguish come up to me and they say, this is the first time that we get to vote. You know, this is the first time. And what do we do? I said, well, I can't tell you who to vote for. I think we as the bishops have published a guide that's available on the internet if you haven't seen it, called Faithful Citizenship. And it's not going to tell you names or parties to vote for, but things to keep in mind. What I would say is I don't think there's a perfect candidate. Boy, is that news to anybody? But I think you have to look at the values that you can reasonably expect and go with that. You know, and then maybe get involved in the political process, because one thing that I think is very sad is the sort of pejorative sense that the word politician engenders. You know, its root is really in the notion of the common good of the people. And it's a noble profession. And if there are political science majors here, I hope you continue. And I hope you throw your hat in someday.
Angela's just stole my question because we have about 5 questions or 6 about voting and hints on voting. So if you want to keep talking about that to our students, that's fine. A couple students noted that they don't normally see an archbishop challenging a governor or a political figure. And they want to get a sense of how you felt during that, what gave you the strength to do that. Did you feel support from other Catholics about that situation?
Well, I have to say that, I really did give it a lot of thought because, there's a strong scriptural tradition, especially in Paul's letters, that we pray for our governors. We pray for those who hold this responsibility. And he was asking people, if you think about it, to pray for a bloodthirsty empire. I mean, the Roman Empire, was not for the weak need. But he said, pray for them. Why? So that we can live our vocation in peace. Well, I think helping refugees is living our vocation. And that's what gave me, I think, the responsibility to say to the governor. I respect him, and I met with them afterwards. And in fact, about a week later, the bishops of Indiana had a scheduled breakfast with them. And of course, there was quite an elephant in the room at the time. And at the end, he said, I hope that this doesn't affect my relationship with Archbishop Tobin. I said, well, Governor, it depends on what it was built on. I like the way Jesus cinches the Sermon on the Mount with his story of the 2 houses. Now, part of the point is the 2 houses look the same on the good days. Can't tell the difference. It's only when the storms come that you can tell which one is set on rock. I said, if our relationship is set on a common belief in Jesus and his kingdom, well, then we're fine. We're going to work this out. And I'd said to him in that meeting in the office, a polemic has to be fed. I'm not going to feed it. You make your own choice. But that statement that I made was the only thing I said before this month. And I thought I accepted these invitations to talk about it, also knowing that we're going to be making a choice next month.
A student asks or says, the State Department has called the treatment of Christians in Syria a genocide. Are there additional responsibilities for victims of genocide over and above those due to refugees?
Well, once again, I don't know if I would prioritize it, as you can do one without the other. It's interesting. Last week I was meeting with Orthodox leaders, and we were talking about the things that have divided our churches for 1,000 years. And we were talking about the situation in Syria, that if somebody wants to kill a Christian, they don't say, are you Catholic or Orthodox? They just kill you. But I think that our faith, as Pope Francis says, must always cause us to look outward. He said, just before he was elected, so that the cardinals knew what they were getting, that a church that turns its eyes in on itself becomes sick. It has to look out. And looking out is not simply for those who share our community of faith, but it's for those who share our humanity and who are being slaughtered in far greater numbers than Christians. Every death is a tragedy, and every death is obscene. But the thought that somehow the Christians this is a persecution of Christians belies the fact that the vast majority of those dead in Syria are Muslim.
Your talk gave us reason to fear, one of your reasons. How do we overcome our fear?
Well, Jesus has a very simple formula. Maybe it's too simple for this. He says, love dispels fear. Love is the antidote to fear. And finally, let me give you an incident I just recalled. A couple years ago, I was at a meeting in Rome, and Pope Francis took part in it. And one bishop kind of got in his face. It wasn't the Archbishop of Indianapolis. It was another bishop. And it wasn't the Archbishop of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And he got in his face because Francis doesn't always cooperate with the security. You must know that. Somebody hands him a piece of pizza, he eats it. You know? And a joke that I used to tell, I'm not sure if I'm going to tell it anymore, but this is supposedly true, that a couple last year sometime, before the Wednesday audience, he was riding around in the Pope Mobile, and a group of people handed him a gourd full of mate. If you're from Argentina or Paraguay, you know mate, yerba mate is like a tea that and it's a very communal thing. You make it and you share it, pass it around. So they handed this gourd up to the Holy Father, and he took a couple slurps and gave it back. Well, the security went ballistic. And they were really letting him have it afterwards. And he finally held up his hands and he said, they were Argentinians. They weren't cardinals. But anyway, in the same line of thinking, at this meeting that I was, this bishop really let him have it. And finally the Pope said, giving my life for Jesus and his kingdom wouldn't be the worst thing that could happen to me or to you. And at that point, the bishop took a step back. Literally took a step back. He didn't figure himself in that equation. So I think that part of it is to have the freedom that Francis embodies, freedom even with my life, saying I'm not going to be turned into something that I'm not. I'm not going to be ruled by fear. Now, that's a lifelong, in my own life, fear took on a new meaning a couple weeks ago. But then you have to try and answer it with love, an experience of God's love and giving it.
How do we maintain sovereignty while still accepting as many refugees as possible?
Well, we can ask, what have we done for the last 3 centuries, practically, or 200 some years? Does anybody really believe that our sovereignty is in danger? I don't know. It was interesting. I saw a survey recently, maybe you saw it, that the parts of the country where there are fewest refugees have the highest fear of them, because they don't know them. I know how proud Ali and Muhammad, whom you saw on that slide, are of their American citizenship. They bought fully into the United States sovereignty. So I don't know any reasons why helping refugees, I think it ennobles our, all you have to do is think of that inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty. They're welcomed. I should point out that, my brother John, wave your hand. Okay, my brother John, who lives here in Minneapolis, who said he brought tomatoes. Well, our grandmother went past that statue when she emigrated from Ireland. And those noble words about give us the ones you don't want, and we'll make something of them. And that's the story of our families. And it'll be the story of these families too.
One student said it's one thing to talk about one family coming and succeeding. What about 1,000 families, and what kind of programs would Catholic Charities or other organizations have for success upon resettlement?
Well, if it's 1,000 families coming to Indianapolis next week, yeah, we'll be strained. I mean, this has strained us. Although we've had wide support in the community, it was interesting. The first donations that came in after the family arrived came from the largest synagogue in Indianapolis, $1,000. So if you think of 1,000 families spread across 100 different Catholic charities, well, it's a little more manageable. I mean, we as Catholic Church are a major player, and we're helping 30% of the refugees who arrive. The amount that we're receiving these days is smaller compared to our northern neighbors in Canada. Maybe the Canadians have more room, but the fact is, I think we have the resources to do it. And once again, this has been the story of our nation. It can continue.
You touched on early employment as a means of self-sufficiency. Could you extrapolate this idea on a practical level?
Well, I think that we have partnerships with different employers in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis who are more than happy to welcome refugees, because basically a lot of these jobs are jobs that the so-called Euro-Americans don't want, and they're doing them, and because we accompany them and we vouch for them and we help them with, manage their funds and until they really can get on their own 2 feet. We provide housing, and it's supervised housing. I think that they're a good bet for an employer. And so I don't believe that refugees are taking any American jobs that Americans really want, but they're finding and contributing and paying taxes, as part of this employment. Employment, I think, also has an important feature of dignity. That people become self-sufficient and can be protagonists of their own lives.
I'm sure you're impressed with our students and their questions.
Yeah, really, yeah, my gosh.
It seems to me that one of the tensions in this issue of student rights is that we are called to minister person to person, yet when we govern its policy socially, how do we go about bridging the divide?
Well, if I understand the question, is how do you have a personal relationship while making policy? Well, I think one, and your Archbishop here is a great jurist, and he would be the first to say that you don't make law for individuals, make law for societies. And you don't make law for hard cases. Those are the exceptions that you deal with in a different way. I think what you try to promote is a social policy that provides opportunities for encounter. Francis has, from the very beginning of his papacy, has talked about a culture of encounter. And with people that, especially that I might avoid otherwise. And so I think that our Catholic charities, and I think Catholic charities in general, by this attention that's given to the individuals and their families, is providing an ongoing encounter and kind of dispelling some of the myths that maybe the refugees arrive with. Now, I remember when I was a young priest in Detroit, my religious order asked me to have an international meeting of redemptorists from around the world. Well, I got a letter before the meeting from a fellow in Brazil, and he said he didn't want to come because he said, all I'll find there in Detroit are white imperialists. See, mustn't have heard of Motown music. But anyway, I said, why don't you just come and see? And I can remember for about 3 days, this fellow said, where are the Americans? I said, these are the Americans. He said, they're not white. I said, no. He said, they don't speak English. I said, a lot of them don't. He said, they're poor. I said, they're very poor. He said, this is the third world. I said, well, maybe the fourth world on the southwest side of Detroit. But my point was that until he had that experience, he had some stereotypes in his head of what Americans were. I know somebody else that might have had one or two, and that's Pope Francis, because I had a meeting with him last summer briefly, and he told me he was so amazed by the United States. He'd never been here till last year. And what impressed him? He said, I never realized how affectionate Americans are. And the second thing is, I didn't know that they took their faith so seriously. So, even a Holy Father needs an encounter, to do away with. I think maybe he saw a lot of Rambo movies as a kid. He thought that's how we were. Anything?
Well, thank you very much for your questions, and let us once again thank Archbishop for the wonderful talk.